In the shadows of the Second World War, beyond the thunder of bombs and the flash of artillery, another kind of battle unfolded, silent, invisible, and mathematical. It was a war of impulses, frequencies, and reflections. A war where oscilloscopes became the eyes of nations, and equations could mean the difference between life and death. This was the hidden war of technology, a contest of minds that shaped the outcome of every night raid and every radar pulse bouncing through the air. When the first antennas of the British chain home system rose along the coasts of England, they looked primitive tall steel towers stretching toward the clouds like skeletal monuments to a new age. Yet behind their simplicity lay one of the most formidable networks of early warning ever conceived. Chain home operated on frequencies between 20 and 30 megahertz, transmitting powerful radio waves far out over the sea. When those waves struck the metallic bodies of incoming aircraft, a faint echo returned, captured and displayed as a trace of light upon a cathode ray tube. The operators, mostly young women trained in the intricacies of pulse timing, could measure the distance and direction of the approaching threat with astonishing precision. Every reflection was a heartbeat of the battle to come. The radar's beam could not see shapes, faces, or insignias, only the cold mathematical presence of something metallic moving fast. Yet that was enough. Britain could now anticipate rather than merely react. The Luftwaffe's formations, once spectral phantoms appearing from the dawn mist, were now ghosts that could be tracked long before they reached the coast. It changed everything. But the Germans were not blind to this new dimension of warfare. Their own experiments with radio detection had begun years before, and by the time the war intensified, they possessed their own systems, Würzburg and Freya. The Freya radar, operating at about 125 megahertz, had longer range and could provide early warning for up to 120 kilometers. The Würzburg, shorter in range but far more precise, became the sharp instrument of control for anti-aircraft batteries and night fighters. Its parabolic dish, gleaming under moonlight, resembled the eye of some mechanical predator watching the skies. These systems formed the backbone of the German air defense network. But the human element organization and strategy would determine how effectively this technology could be used. General Joseph Kammhuber envisioned an integrated system of defense sectors, each equipped with radar, searchlights, and a dedicated night fighter. His concept became known as the Kammhuber Line, a ribbon of overlapping zones stretching across Western Europe. Within each sector, a radar operator guided the night fighter toward its target through voice instructions, vectors of invisible light threading through darkness. It was a technological ballet. The British bombers flew into the night, engines humming in disciplined formation, unaware or perhaps unmindful that somewhere above or below them, another machine was listening. The radar operator spoke in terse, coded bursts. Target, 20 left, range 4. The fighter banked, climbed, and dove, searching for the faint glimmer of a shadow against the starlight. For every successful interception, hundreds of man-hours of listening, calculating, and calibrating had taken place. The war of frequencies soon grew more complex. Both sides realized that to survive, they had to deceive. In 1943, British scientists introduced a simple yet devastatingly effective weapon of confusion, window. It consisted of nothing more than strips of aluminum foil, cut precisely to resonate at the enemy radar's wavelength. Released in bundles from bombers, these metallic confetti clouds filled the sky with thousands of false echoes. On German radar screens, the clear geometry of the bomber stream dissolved into a blizzard of meaningless blips. Würzburg and Freya operators found their scopes suddenly alive with ghosts. Every pulse returned an illusion. Every bearing was a lie. The Germans were quick to adapt. They called the British countermeasure Duppel, and developed their own systems of electronic deception and countermeasures. But for a time, window tilted the balance of the nocturnal struggle. The massive raids over Hamburg in July 1943, known as Operation Gomorrah, demonstrated its power. As aluminum clouds drifted above the city, the air defense network collapsed into confusion. Searchlights probed empty sky, anti-aircraft guns fired at phantoms, and night fighters circled without orders. Below, the fires raged uncontrolled. In the control rooms, scientists and officers alike stared at the dancing green lines of their scopes, trying to separate truth from illusion. Some believed the echoes might represent entire squadrons. Others suspected natural interference. But it was the birth of electronic warfare as we now understand it, a domain where information itself becomes a weapon. Every pulse, every delay, every decibel of signal-to-noise ratio mattered. Engineers on both sides became soldiers in a new kind of combat. One fought not with rifles, but with oscillators and vacuum tubes. They worked tirelessly to refine their systems, modulating pulse repetition frequencies, shaping antenna beams, filtering static from thunderclouds. Each improvement was measured in seconds of warning, or meters of accuracy. Yet those tiny increments could determine the outcome of a battle involving thousands of lives. As the war progressed, radar operators developed a unique relationship with their instruments. The hum of transformers, the flicker of phosphor, the smell of warm electronics became as familiar as the rhythm of breathing. They learned to interpret subtle distortions in the trace, to sense when a contact was real or merely noise. In many cases, their intuition outpaced theory. They were reading patterns that science itself had only just begun to describe. Meanwhile, the bomber crews, enclosed within their aluminum shells high above the clouds, lived by the rhythm of the radio beam and the ticking clock. They trusted that somewhere far below, the great machines of Chain Home were watching over them. The pilots never saw the radar towers. They knew them only through the calm voice of the controller guiding them home. Turn heading 270. You are clear of pursuit. That calmness was itself a weapon, a thread of confidence woven through the chaos of war. By 1944, both sides had built vast webs of electromagnetic warfare. Countermeasures led to countermeasures in an endless spiral of adaptation. The Germans experimented with passive radar detection, using systems that could locate the source of British radar emissions without transmitting their own. The British, in turn, deployed airborne radar systems, AI Mark IV, Mark VIII, and others, that turned night fighters into hunters, equipped with their own electronic eyes. For the first time, the darkness belonged to no one. It became a shared, contested medium and ocean of signals, where every echo could be an enemy, every silence a trap. The crews who operated within this realm rarely saw the results of their work directly, but they shaped the invisible architecture of victory. Each new innovation left a signature trace, a change in the shape of the blip, the curvature of the beam, the rhythm of the pulse. To the untrained eye, it was meaningless. To those who knew, it was the language of survival. As the air war deepened, the night itself became an instrument of strategy. Each side sought to master the darkness, to bend it into a weapon. British scientists, working in secret at laboratories scattered across the countryside, refined the technology of airborne interception AI radar. These compact units fitted into the noses of twin-engine night fighters, like the Bristol Beaufighter, and later the de Havilland Mosquito, gave pilots their own window into the unseen. Inside the cockpit, the radar operator watched a small cathode ray screen, its luminous sweep turning endlessly like a heartbeat. Blips would appear, one representing the fighter's own position, the others faint marks of the enemy ahead. Communication between pilot and operator became a ritual of calm precision. Target, 10 degrees left, closing, range 2000. The pilot would adjust, trusting the invisible dance of electrons. It was not the beauty of flight, but the precision of geometry that ruled these encounters. The pilot could not see his enemy until the last seconds, often firing blind into the dark, guided only by the instruments. A successful intercept was a triumph not of vision, but of calculation. The difference between death and survival was measured in milliseconds of pulse return, in the sensitivity of a receiver tube, in the stability of an antenna mount buffeted by icy winds. The Kammhuber Line evolved in response. German command understood that electronic warfare demanded constant vigilance, and they refined their defensive network accordingly. The original belt of radar sectors expanded into a complex grid of overlapping fields, each supported by ground controllers and connected through telephone and radio lines. Every Würzburg radar dish became a node in a growing web of detection, transmitting data to command posts that plotted bomber tracks in real time. Yet the British air staff had learned the system's rhythm. They understood that the Kammhuber Line depended on coordination and precise timing, and that overwhelming it was a matter not of brute force, but of confusion. Instead of sending bombers in dispersed formations, they concentrated them into narrow bomber streams. Hundreds of aircraft would pass through a single sector within minutes, saturating the defenses. The radar operators, unable to distinguish individual echoes, found their screens crowded with targets. Voice channels jammed with overlapping reports. The night fighters, guided to the wrong altitude or vector, chased phantoms until fuel ran low. It was chaos by design. A calculated overload of information. The British had turned the enemy's precision against him. What began as an organized chain of logic now dissolved into statistical noise. For the scientists and engineers who followed the progress of these nocturnal duels, the war was an ongoing experiment in applied physics. They tracked not just bombers and fighters, but also the evolution of the electromagnetic spectrum as a field of conflict. New frequencies appeared, new modulation patterns, new pulse codes. The laboratory became as vital as the battlefield. Every destroyed radar installation, every captured transmitter offered data for the next innovation. German engineers answered with their own ingenuity. They developed the Liechtenstein radar for night fighters, enabling intercepts even when ground guidance was lost. It operated in the 490 MHz band and used distinctive mattress antenna arrays protruding from the aircraft's nose ungainly, but deadly. The British soon learned to detect its emissions and built receivers to warn bomber crews when enemy fighters were nearby. Thus began a deadly feedback loop. Emit, detect, counter, conceal. In 1943, the British introduced the Monica tail warning radar for bombers. It alerted crews when a night fighter approached from behind. But soon, German scientists created Flensburg, a receiver that could home in on Monica's transmissions, turning the hunter's warning system into a beacon for pursuit. Dozens of bombers were lost before the link was discovered, and Monica withdrawn. Each discovery felt like a betrayal by physics itself. What had been designed as protection became a vulnerability. The electromagnetic spectrum was impartial. It served whoever could manipulate it best. And then there was the question of jamming. As the war entered its later years, both sides deployed transmitters that flooded radar frequencies with noise. Operators would twist their dials, adjusting gain, searching for clarity, only to find the screens filled with static. The delicate rhythm of pulses, so carefully tuned in laboratories, was drowned beneath a roar of electronic chaos. The British used jamming to blind Würzburg radars before large raids, while the Germans responded with frequency hopping and more powerful amplifiers. Each advance pushed the limits of what the fragile vacuum tubes could endure. Engineers spoke of signal-to-noise ratio, as soldiers spoke of ammunition. Without it, no weapon could strike. Meanwhile, the art of deception became ever more elaborate. False radio transmissions imitated bomber group controllers. Decoy aircraft, constructed of wood and fabric, reflected radar signals to create phantom formations. Balloons carrying corner reflectors mimicked bombers on the move. The air itself became thick with lies. To the radar operators staring into their screens, it was as though the laws of reality had begun to waver. Sometimes echoes appeared where no aircraft could possibly be. Sometimes entire fleets vanished into silence. The more advanced the technology became, the more fragile its truth seemed. And yet, through this fog of deception, both sides grew more disciplined. Operators learned to read subtle cues, the shape of a blip, the stability of its motion, the rhythm of its pulse decay. They developed an instinct for authenticity. In the clutter of false returns, they could sense when something was real. It was intuition built from thousands of hours spent watching the living pulse of radar. By late 1944, radar and counter-radar had become the backbone of strategic decision-making. The Allied invasion of Normandy was guided, protected, and in many ways enabled by electronic superiority. Radar beacons marked beaches and drop zones for paratroopers. Countermeasures confused German coastal defenses. The Great Deception operations. Fortitude, Glimmer, Taxable used radar echoes and false signals to convince the enemy that the landings would come elsewhere. Graphs and impulses, once confined to laboratory notebooks, now decided the fate of armies. The map of Europe, viewed through the lens of technology, had transformed into a web of invisible energies. Every city, every base, every coastline emitted or reflected some signal. Engineers began to think of the continent not in terms of geography, but in terms of frequencies bands of power and interference, zones of silence and clarity. It was the first hint of the information age to come. To the bomber command crews flying their nightly missions, this invisible war was ever present yet intangible. They heard it as static in their headphones, saw it as the flicker of lights on their radar screens, felt it as sudden shifts in their instruments. When a radar operator whispered, "Multiple returns must be window," it was a reminder that their survival depended not only on courage, but on the unpredictable alchemy of science. Each mission was a gamble across the electromagnetic sea. The aircraft carried not only bombs, but also transmitters, reflectors, jammers, and decoys. Each tuned for a specific frequency, each designed to manipulate what the enemy could see. And so, in the great laboratories of Baudsee, Malvern, and Peenemünde, scientists continued to refine their art. They plotted new pulse shapes, drew waveforms across graph paper, calculated reflection coefficients of foil and paint. They were modern alchemists seeking to control the invisible. The tools of their craft oscilloscopes, signal generators, spectrum analyzers were as vital to the war effort as tanks or rifles. In the end, radar was not merely a machine. It was a way of perceiving the world, of turning time into distance, reflection into knowledge. It allowed nations to see without eyes, to strike without light. And when the war finally ended, and the echoes of the last transmissions faded into peacetime silence, those who had served in the secret war of electronics knew that they had witnessed the dawn of something far greater. For in the silent pulses that once guarded coastlines and guided night fighters, the seeds of the digital future had already begun to grow. In the aftermath of 1943, the race for electronic supremacy accelerated. Laboratories became arsenals, and every new wavelength was a battlefield. The war was no longer just about speed, armor, or firepower. It was about information. The armies of technicians, mathematicians, and radio engineers were now as critical as the pilots and infantry. Each new breakthrough seemed to rewrite the rules. When British scientists first demonstrated centimetric radar-using magnetrons to generate short wavelengths near 10 centimeters, it was as though a veil had been lifted. These shorter wavelengths produced sharper reflections, allowing detection of smaller objects with unprecedented accuracy. For the first time, radar could distinguish between ships, aircraft, and even the contours of the coastline. It could see through rain and darkness alike, mapping the world with invisible light. Mounted aboard aircraft, the new H2S radar transformed navigation and bombing. The screen displayed a ghostly image of the terrain below rivers, cities, coastlines rendered as luminous outlines. To the crews of Bomber Command, it was a revelation. They could now strike through cloud and night, guided by the reflections of their own transmitted pulses. But this same innovation became a gift to the enemy as well. When the wreckage of a downed British bomber was recovered in early 1943, German engineers discovered an intact H2S set. The capture of this device triggered a frenzy of research within the Luftwaffe. From its components, they created Naxos, a receiver capable of detecting H2S emissions from afar. Night fighters equipped with Naxos could home in on the faint whisper of microwave pulses emitted by the bombers themselves. Once again, the hunter and the hunted traded places in the electromagnetic maze. It was a pattern that would repeat endlessly throughout the war. Innovation breeding vulnerability, advantage breeding exposure. The British responded with improved versions of H2S, shifting frequencies, tightening beam control, and adding coded pulse patterns to resist interception. At the same time, German countermeasures evolved, devices like Corfu, and Flensburg, which tuned across wide frequency bands, listening for the telltale heartbeat of Allied radar. The skies of Europe had become a dense forest of invisible sound. Every radar pulse, every burst of static, every faint carrier wave represented an exchange in a silent dialogue of survival. On the ground, the battle took on new forms. Operators of the Freya and Würzburg systems worked in dimly lit bunkers, their screens glowing pale green against the blackness. Sweat gathered on their brows as they tracked moving blips across the grid. The rhythm of the rotating antenna was hypnotic, each sweep a pulse of expectation. Sometimes the echoes came strong and clear. Sometimes they faded into background hiss. To the uninitiated, it might have seemed monotonous. To those who knew, each flicker was life itself. When window reappeared in the skies, thousands of strips of foil tumbling in moonlight, it produced an eerie effect. On the radar scope, it looked like a storm of metal snow. Operators tried to filter it out using techniques of pulse integration and Doppler discrimination, but the confusion remained overwhelming. Experienced hands could sometimes sense patterns within the chaos, a faint movement that betrayed the real bomber stream among the false echoes. But this demanded inhuman concentration. Many reported headaches, blurred vision, and ringing ears from the constant effort. For radar scientists, the challenge of window inspired deeper study of clutter and signal discrimination. New methods were proposed: pulse compression, frequency diversity, and mathematical prediction of target movement. These ideas, developed under wartime urgency, would later become the foundations of modern signal processing. It was a strange paradox. The more destructive the war became, the more it accelerated human understanding of the invisible world. Meanwhile, the night skies of Europe turned into theaters of electronic drama. British Mosquito night fighters, equipped with AI Meki-8 radar, stalked German interceptors. Using radar emissions from enemy aircraft as lures, they could ambush the hunters themselves. In some cases, a Mosquito pilot would switch off his own radar to avoid detection, gliding in silence until he could catch the glow of exhaust from a Liechtenstein-equipped Bf-110 or Ju-88. Then, in a brief blaze of cannon fire, the duel ended. The battle was measured not just in speed or altitude, but in frequency and wavelength. Each side tried to find windows of invisibility, spectral gaps where their signals would go unnoticed. Engineers spoke of black frequencies ranges of the spectrum where neither side had effective receivers. These invisible sanctuaries never lasted long. Once discovered, they became contested ground. To outsiders, it seemed abstract, almost bloodless. But within this invisible arena, the toll was immense. Crews perished without ever seeing their attackers. Entire formations vanished into radar shadows or fell victim to jamming miscalculations. The death was real, even if the means were mathematical. The term electronic warfare was still new then, barely understood outside a small circle of specialists, but its implications were already profound. It had revealed that victory was not only a matter of physical dominance, but also of perception of who could shape what the other side saw and believed. By 1944, radar coverage had become so dense that the sky itself seemed wired. The Kammhuber Line, once a symbol of organized defense, was now fragmented, its sectors struggling under relentless pressure. Allied planners, aware of its structure, designed raids to exploit its weaknesses. They timed bomber streams to cross sector boundaries precisely when night fighters were being rotated, leaving temporary gaps in coverage. It was war conducted through scheduling and synchronization, a contest of timing rather than muscle. And yet, amid this machinery of precision, moments of human instinct still mattered. Radar operators learned to recognize the feel of a real contact, the steadiness of the trace, the subtle wobble of a false echo. Veteran controllers could detect a bomber formation by intuition alone, predicting its course even when the data was incomplete. It was the marriage of machine logic and human perception that gave radar its power. In Britain, Chainhome continued its silent vigil along the coast. Though crude by modern standards, it remained invaluable for long-range detection. Its massive steel towers, often mistaken by civilians for ordinary radio masts, had become symbols of unseen guardianship. Many of the operators were women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, trained to read the faintest flickers of light and report bearings with mechanical accuracy. Their calm voices filled the plotting rooms where controllers moved colored counters across vast maps, each representing an aircraft, each a pulse of war. When the great raids over the Ruhr or Berlin began, the interplay between radar, radio, and deception reached its most complex form. H-2S provided navigation. Window shielded the bombers. Jamming units blinded enemy guns, and ground radar tracked the return path to England. Every layer of the electromagnetic spectrum was alive with purpose. Even as the Allies gained dominance, the Germans refused to yield the technological field. They experimented with infrared detection, hoping to see bombers by their heat signatures, and with passive radar systems that listened for enemy transmissions without revealing their own presence. Projects like Klein-Heidelberg sought to use reflections of British radar signals to triangulate bomber positions, an early form of bastatic radar. Though these systems came too late to alter the course of the war, they foreshadowed the remote sensing technologies that would define later decades. In laboratories across Europe, amid the whine of generators and the glow of vacuum tubes, a quiet realization was dawning. The world had entered a new era, an age where knowledge of invisible energies would determine power. The war had turned physics into strategy, and strategy into mathematics. For those who had worked in secrecy, scientists, mathematicians, and radio operators, the end of hostilities did not bring silence, but transition. The instruments that once guided night fighters were now studied for peacetime uses. Air traffic control, meteorology, navigation. But the memory of what those pulses had once meant lingered. Each blip, each echo, had once carried the weight of human lives. When peace returned, the radar towers still stood against the sky, their steel frames rusting in the salt wind. Birds nested among their crossbeams. Children played in their shadows, unaware that these relics had once been the sentinels of a nation's survival. But those who remembered knew that beneath the surface of every peaceful radio transmission, every flicker of an airport radar, there still echoed the ghosts of that hidden war. The pulses that once defined the edge between light and darkness. By 1944, the electromagnetic struggle had reached its most intricate form. The airwaves were crowded with competing signals. Some deliberate, some accidental, all dangerous. The entire sky seemed alive with invisible movement. The war had evolved into a contest of pattern and deception, fought by minds that could read meaning in oscillations and noise. Every major raid now unfolded like a symphony of interference. The British deployed aircraft equipped with specialized transmitters, Mondrill to jam early warning radar, Carpet to disrupt Würzburg tracking stations, and Jostle to drown out German communications. The jamming frequencies were chosen with surgical precision, each calculated to blind a segment of the enemy network just long enough for the bombers to pass. The Germans countered by adjusting receiver bandwidths and employing redundancy multiple radars operating at slightly offset frequencies. They also developed the WWII, a sophisticated direction-finding service that could triangulate the positions of Allied bombers from their own radio chatter. Even silence became a signal to be interpreted. Every gap in the spectrum hinted at movement. Inside command bunkers, officers and technicians pored over graphs and time plots. They compared pulse intervals, drew frequency charts, and marked sudden surges of noise. To them, the war no longer looked like territory and front lines. It appeared as patterns of interference, as peaks and valleys in an invisible landscape of power. Somewhere in this chaos, the Kammhuber Line still pulsed with life. Though battered and fragmented, its spirit endured. Each radar station, each Würzburg, I remained a node of vigilance. The system had evolved from a rigid grid into a fluid, adaptive network. Commanders rerouted communications, deployed mobile radar units, and reorganized fighter zones to plug the holes torn open by Allied tactics. But even this ingenuity faced limits. The introduction of long-range Allied night fighters mosquitoes, equipped with their own AI radars, turned the tables on German interceptors. The hunters became the hunted. Each German night fighter that took off risked detection before it even found its target. Pilots learned to recognize the eerie flicker of jamming and the faint hum of an unseen pursuer. The air was no longer empty. It was a dense fog of information. For the crews on both sides, survival depended on trusting the voice in their ear and the light on the scope. To the pilot, the radar operator's words were both compass and conscience. In the dark cockpit, the operator's calm tone could cut through the fear. Steady range, decreasing target ahead. A moment later, the sky erupted with tracer fire, a split-second burst of human decision carried out at machine speed. The pulse of radar had merged with the pulse of life itself. On the British side, radar science had become a national obsession. At Malvern's telecommunications research establishment, teams of young physicists, many only recently graduated from universities, worked under intense secrecy. They experimented with frequency-modulated signals, pulse compression, and high-speed cathode ray oscillographs. The blackboards of their laboratories were filled with equations describing propagation delay, Doppler shifts, and antenna gain. They spoke a language that only they could understand, one where each symbol represented not abstraction, but survival. Among these scientists was a quiet recognition that their work extended beyond the immediate war. The techniques they developed, pulse analysis, filtering, tracking algorithms, were glimpses of a future where machines might one day process information faster than humans. It was, unknowingly, the dawn of computing intelligence. Across the channel, German engineers were reaching similar conclusions. Their research into radar, guidance, and control systems gave rise to early analog computers, mechanical and electronic devices that could predict trajectories or stabilize weapons. The boundaries between radar science, mathematics, and automation began to blur. The war had forced humanity to think like machines and teach machines to think like humans. Meanwhile, the art of deception continued to evolve. The Allies perfected spoofing operations, phantom bomber formations broadcast by a few aircraft carrying heavy radar reflectors and transmitters. These decoy raids drew fighters away from real targets. Some missions involved aircraft orbiting far from the main force, transmitting pulses designed to mimic hundreds of bombers. On the German screens, entire phantom armadas appeared, moving inexorably toward phantom cities. Controllers scrambled defenses, only to find empty skies. It was the triumph of illusion, a form of warfare that existed purely in the imagination of the machines that fought it. But even amid this complexity, the simplest tools retained power. Window remained devastatingly effective. In July 1944, during the massive raids preceding the Normandy invasion, clouds of foil drifted across the radar horizon, confusing defenders for hours. Würzburg operators would watch helplessly as their screens filled with dancing reflections. The mathematics of detection was perfect, but the inputs had been poisoned. It was an enduring lesson. Even the most advanced systems could be undone by simplicity if the deception aligned with physics. The analysts who studied radar plots after each mission began to notice a strange beauty in their data. The arcs of bomber streams, the bursts of jamming, the scatter of reflections, they formed patterns like constellations in an electronic night sky. Behind the cold numbers, there was a rhythm, a pulse of human ingenuity mirrored in the machines they had created. By late 1944, Germany's radar network had been forced to retreat behind its own borders. Mobile units replaced fixed installations, operating from trucks or bunkers that could be moved overnight. The Freya stations became increasingly rare, their signals too easily tracked by Allied intelligence. In contrast, the Allies built an expanding radar empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Alps. The chain home stations were now only part of a global web that included shipborne radar, airborne radar, and portable battlefield systems. Each advance in radar also transformed the psychology of war. Pilots and crews developed a new relationship with uncertainty. They no longer fought only against visible enemies, but against invisible systems of detection and prediction. Every transmission risked exposure. Every silence risked ignorance. It was a delicate equilibrium, and only those who mastered both sides survived. To understand the magnitude of this transformation, one must imagine the war map not as a geography of land and sea, but as a topology of signal strength and reflection. The front lines were measured in decibels, not kilometers. Mountains became obstacles, not just to movement, but to propagation. The curvature of the Earth limited radar range. Weather introduced scattering and attenuation. Even the ionosphere, that ghostly mirror in the upper atmosphere, played a role-bending long-wave signals beyond the horizon, allowing both miracles and misunderstandings. In such a war, graphs became weapons. Technicians plotted signal amplitude over time, searching for anomalies that revealed hidden transmitters. Analysts used statistical graphs to estimate the density of window in the air and predict how long the confusion would last. Mathematicians created probability curves for interception success, modeling the night sky as a stochastic system. The fate of thousands could hinge on a misread oscillograph trace. Each flicker of the radar beam carried a story. The operator might never know whose life depended on it, but somewhere, someone did. The more the war pushed into abstraction, the more it revealed the strange intimacy between humans and their machines. Operators spoke of their radars as living companions, temperamental, sensitive, capable of moods. They tapped the casing when the signal drifted, whispered encouragements when the trace reappeared. They felt pride when the system performed flawlessly, and guilt when it failed. The boundaries between man and machine blurred in the glow of the cathode ray tube. When victory finally began to tilt decisively toward the Allies, it was not because of any single invention, but because of the accumulated mastery of the invisible. The Germans had brilliance, but the Allies had integration, hundreds of systems working in concert: radar, jamming, navigation, intelligence. They had learned to orchestrate complexity. And in that orchestration, they had also glimpsed the shape of the modern world. The war of radars and impulses had proven that control of information meant control of destiny. From then on, every future conflict and every peace would be fought first in the realm of data, signal, and deception. For those who had served in that hidden war, the end brought not relief, but reflection. They had seen the unseen, shaped the intangible, and realized that the future would belong to those who could read the invisible language of the world. The final years of the war saw the invisible battlefield reach its most sophisticated and most desperate phase. The once distinct lines between detection, communication, and weaponry began to blur completely. What had begun as a method to see beyond the horizon was now the beating heart of command itself. Every strategy, every bombing raid, every interception depended on the manipulation of frequencies and the reading of ghostly echoes. By early 1945, radar was everywhere. It stood on cliffs and ship decks, on airfields and rooftops, in submarines and night fighters. The electromagnetic spectrum had become a new kind of territory mapped, contested, and defended. To those who lived within this realm, the world no longer appeared as land, sea, and sky, but as a lattice of signals, reflections, and shadows. The British chain home stations, once the backbone of defense, were now part of a global network. Their long-range pulses reached far out over the Atlantic, guiding convoys through U-boat zones. In the icy waters, small escort ships used radar to hunt submarines that had once stalked them unseen. The German U-boats responded with METOCs, primitive radar detectors that warned of approaching aircraft. But like every advantage in this technological duel, it was temporary. The Allies soon changed frequencies, rendering the detectors useless, and then used the U-boat's own emissions to reveal their positions. It was a cruel symmetry. The act of seeing made one visible. In the air, the struggle continued with even greater intensity. Allied bombers carried an arsenal of electronics H2S for navigation, oboe for precision guidance, carpet for jamming, and fish pond to detect upward-firing German fighters. Each device filled a specific niche in the growing ecosystem of electromagnetic survival. The crew of a single Lancaster bomber might handle a dozen different frequencies in one mission, adjusting knobs, switching channels, interpreting signals. To operate such complexity required a new kind of soldier, part warrior, part engineer, part mathematician. They were called operators, but their role was far more profound. They were interpreters of the unseen. Their skill lay not in pulling a trigger, but in knowing what the patterns meant. The Germans, pressed on all fronts, continued to innovate under bombardment. Their scientists refined the Berlin radar, a close cousin to the British H2S, using a cavity magnetron captured from Allied wreckage. Despite shortages of materials and power, they produced radar sets small enough to fit into aircraft, precise enough to guide anti-aircraft guns, and robust enough to resist jamming for a few precious seconds. Seconds mattered. Each heartbeat of radar time represented about 150 meters of space. Every missed echo, every distorted pulse, could mean the loss of an aircraft or the destruction of a city. Engineers calculated pulse lengths, repetition frequencies, and phase errors as though they were ballistics. The language of war had become mathematical. In the plotting rooms of both sides, maps were covered not with flags or arrows, but with signal arcs. Controllers no longer thought in terms of distance, but of delay. Time itself had become the new geography. The Kammhuber Line, once rigid and linear, now existed mostly as an idea, a framework of vigilance sustained by habit and courage. Its operators knew the system was being overwhelmed, yet they continued their nightly routines. They tracked what they could, warned when possible, and fought with a precision born from despair. Meanwhile, the British Bomber Command transformed chaos into coordination. Their bomber streams flowed with the rhythm of an engineered storm. Radio navigation beams like G and oboe guided them to targets through cloud and flak. The timing of every pulse and reflection was calculated to perfection. It was no longer mere bombing. It was choreography. And behind the scenes, in secret rooms filled with humming machines, analysts recorded every frequency intercepted during the raids. These rooms were filled with paper rolls of recorded signals, sheets of graph paper covered in spikes and dips, operators leaning over oscillographs to mark anomalies. Out of these data traces emerged the first real understanding of the electromagnetic environment as a living, changing system. It was here, in the quiet hours between missions, that the first concepts of electronic intelligence ELINT were born. Engineers realized that radar could be studied not just for its immediate tactical use, but as a source of strategic knowledge. By identifying a radar's pulse repetition rate, its modulation pattern, or its antenna sweep speed, analysts could deduce its model, its operator's skill, even its purpose. Each signal became a fingerprint of the enemy's mind. In this way, the war gave birth to something entirely new, the science of information itself. The Germans pursued similar ideas. Their radio intelligence units catalogued every Allied radar and communication signal they could find. They built vast tables of frequencies, comparing them over time, predicting when and where new systems would appear. They even employed captured Allied scientists and equipment in desperate attempts to reverse engineer the enemy's invisible arsenal. But time was running out. By 1945, the Allies had achieved not just superiority, but dominance over the electromagnetic domain. Their radars guided fleets across the Channel, their jammers silenced enemy guns, and their night fighters ruled the skies. Every major invasion or raid was prefaced by a calculated storm of interference that blinded the enemy's sensors. The sky turned to static, and out of that static came the machines of victory. Still, even at the end, the war of radar retained a strange intimacy. In the final months, German operators reported eerie moments of silence frequencies gone dead, echoes vanishing without reason. Sometimes the silence meant that their systems had been jammed. Sometimes it meant that the transmitters themselves had been destroyed. Sometimes, in the confusion, it meant only that there was nothing left to detect. The British, too, experienced a peculiar melancholy as their long-range radars watched the echoes of retreating German aircraft fade into nothingness. The familiar rhythms of warning and tracking began to quiet. For years, those pulses had filled the nights like a heartbeat. Now, with the end approaching, the screens grew still. But the scientists and engineers who had lived in this secret world were already looking beyond the war. They had glimpsed a new kind of power, one that did not depend on size or brute force, but on control of information and the manipulation of the unseen. The same principles that guided radar could guide ships, aircraft, and even machines that thought. When the first experiments in digital computing began in the closing months of the war, many of the people involved were radar veterans. They had learned how to translate signals into meaning, how to handle data at the speed of light, how to trust a machine's precision over human instinct. The continuity between radar and computing was not accidental. Both were born from the same impulse, to see patterns where the eye could not, to find order in the chaos of time and noise. Even the vocabulary endured: pulses, gates, feedback, delay lines. The cathode ray screens that once showed aircraft now displayed equations, bits, and memory states. The operators who had watched the skies now watched logic unfold in green light. It was said among the radar veterans that the war had created a new sense of perception. They spoke of feeling the signals, of seeing without seeing. It was a mental adaptation to a world where information replaced vision. And though peace returned, the world they had built did not vanish. The radar towers, the jammers, the receivers. Many were dismantled, but the knowledge they embodied continued to evolve. Within a few years, radar would guide civil airliners across oceans, track weather systems, and monitor the stars. Yet for those who remembered the war, these peaceful uses carried a haunting echo. Every sweep of the antenna, every pulse of reflection, still reminded them of nights when the same signals meant life or death. They had lived through a war where victory depended not on who fired first, but on who saw first, and who could make the other blind. In the end, the war of radar was not just a battle of machines. It was the moment humanity discovered that perception itself could be engineered. And once that discovery had been made, the world could never again return to the innocence of the unaided eye. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the echoes of the radar war continued to pulse across the world. The antennas still turned. The transmitters still hummed. The green eyes of the cathode ray tubes still blinked faintly in the empty control rooms, their traces fading slowly into darkness. Yet even in peace, no one could forget what had been revealed. The invisible skeleton of reality itself, mapped by pulses of energy, and shaped by human intent. The men and women who had lived inside that invisible war emerged changed. They had seen how light could be sculpted into knowledge, how mathematics could sense motion, and how the unseen could be made visible. To them, the world was no longer static or solid. It was alive with waves. Radio, sound, radar interacting, reflecting, colliding. Reality was a signal to be interpreted. For Britain, the legacy of Chain Home endured long after its towers were decommissioned. The system that had once stood as a wall of vigilance became the foundation of civil aviation and weather forecasting. Its massive steel skeletons, corroding quietly by the sea, had given birth to an age of surveillance, safety, and global communication. Across Europe, the remnants of Würzburg and Freya were gathered by Allied scientists. They studied the German designs with respect, even admiration. The precision of their engineering, the elegance of their pulse timing, the mathematical clarity of their parabolic reflectors, all were invaluable lessons. Out of the ashes of destruction, a new international science of radar was born, one that transcended national boundaries. But the war had also shown that technology and ethics could not be separated. The same frequencies that guided bombers could also guide peace. The same minds that built instruments of detection could build instruments of understanding. Yet the line between the two remained as fragile as a pulse of light. For a time, the veterans of the electronic war gathered in quiet conferences, comparing notes and diagrams, translating wartime secrecy into post-war collaboration. They wrote papers on pulse discrimination, Doppler filtering, and range gate theory concepts that would one day power not only radar, but digital computing and telecommunications. It was in these gatherings that the bridge between wartime radar and peacetime computing became clear. The engineers who had synchronized pulses to measure distance began synchronizing them to perform logic. The cathode ray tubes that once tracked aircraft now displayed binary operations, and the hum of generators gave way to the rhythmic clicking of relays and vacuum tubes counting in base 2. The hidden war had not merely been fought, it had evolved. In the United States, captured research from both sides was poured into new programs. The MIT Radiation Laboratory, which had been the nerve center of Allied radar innovation, transformed into a crucible of post-war science. Many of its veterans went on to create the first digital control systems, early warning networks, and guided missiles. Their wartime mastery of pulse timing and phase synchronization became the foundation of modern electronics. Meanwhile, in Germany and Britain, scientists who had once opposed each other now collaborated on civil radar, meteorology, and television. They shared a strange kinship born of shared obsession, the understanding that, in the realm of signals, enemies had spoken the same mathematical language. It was this shared legacy that defined the technological century to come. The Kammhuber Line, though destroyed in battle, lived on as a conceptual ancestor of modern air defense networks. The very idea of linked detection nodes, centralized command, and coordinated response would resurface in the Cold War's integrated radar systems, SAGE in America, and its counterparts across the Soviet bloc. The dream of total surveillance over the skies, born out of fear and necessity, became the architecture of a new kind of peace: deterrence by awareness. And yet, even as radar grew more powerful, the philosophical questions it raised deepened. During the war, radar had inverted the nature of vision. Humans no longer relied on light bouncing off objects into their eyes. Instead, they created light radio light and measured its echo. In doing so, they redefined what it meant to see. It was a profound transformation. Vision was no longer passive, it was active, interrogative, creative. Humanity had learned to illuminate the dark, not with flame, but with inquiry. The operators who once sat in dim radar huts could now look back and recognize the poetry of what they had done. Each sweep of the antenna had been a question flung into the void. What is out there? And each returning echo had been an answer from the world itself. I am here. Even the simplest tools of deception like window, those strips of aluminum foil fluttering through the night sky, took on a new symbolism in hindsight. They were physical metaphors for the uncertainty of knowledge. Reflections of truth scattered until it became impossible to tell what was real. The war had taught that vision, whether through eyes or through instruments, was never absolute. It was always mediated, filtered, interpreted. In the laboratories that followed the war, the lessons of electronic combat gave rise to a new field: cybernetics. Norbert Wiener, who had worked on predicting aircraft trajectories for anti-aircraft systems, began to imagine feedback not just in machines, but in thought itself. His equations of control and communication grew directly from wartime radar experiments, from the feedback loops that had guided searchlights and guns to track moving targets. The feedback pulse of radar had become a metaphor for the feedback pulse of mind. Meanwhile, in the ruins of Europe, new technologies bloomed. Airport radar towers rose where anti-aircraft sites once stood. Weather radars spun over coastal cities, tracing storms instead of bombers. The same mathematics that once calculated death now forecasted rain. But the memory of what those equations had cost never faded. Among the surviving operators of the Kammhuber Line, there were stories of nights when radar screens glowed brighter than the moon, when the sky was so full of echoes that even silence seemed to vibrate. They spoke of exhaustion so deep that they began to see patterns in static faces, words, ghostly movements that weren't there. The war of frequencies had imprinted itself not only on machines, but on the human mind. And yet there was pride. For all the destruction, there was also creation, the creation of a new kind of intelligence. Those who once interpreted blips on cathode screens now trained a new generation of scientists. Their students would go on to design satellites, computers, and networks that extended the logic of radar into space and time. The pulse that once measured distance between aircraft now measured distance between stars. In a sense, the war of radar never ended. It merely expanded into new media, new devices, new definitions of reality. The modern world of GPS, surveillance satellites, stealth aircraft, and digital communication still follows the same principles first tested in that hidden war. The pulse goes out, the echo returns. The difference between them, time, delay, distortion, is meaning. Every signal humanity sends today, from a smartphone to a deep space probe, carries within it the lineage of those wartime pulses. Every time a machine measures reflection, it reenacts the logic born on the coasts of Britain and the airfields of Europe. And perhaps, somewhere within the static, there remains an echo of the voices that once spoke over the airwaves, calm, precise, and human. Target bearing 230. Range closing. Voices that reached into the night, not with hatred, but with purpose to understand, to locate, to survive. History remembers the battles of radar in statistics and machinery. But beneath the graphs and frequencies, it was always a human story. The story of people who stared into noise and found signal, who listened into silence and heard truth, who taught themselves to see the invisible. They fought not only for nations, but for the mastery of perception itself. And in doing so, they changed forever the way humanity looks at the world. For from that hidden war of technology, of pulses and echoes, of foil and fear, was born the age we now inhabit. An age where every heartbeat of communication, every reflection of light, every whisper of data carries the faint, indelible trace of those first daring attempts to make darkness visible. The war of radar was over. But its signal still travels on, forever bouncing between history and the horizon.